Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vatsal. I am currently working at PlaySimple Games. The talk that I'm going to be doing today is called Imitating to Iterate and Innovate, creating a better V2, because somebody else has already made a V1 that we like and is making money at this point in time, right? A little bit about me. I am currently a game director at PlaySimple Games. I have been working in games for about 13 years or so now. Have worked at companies like Flare Games, Zynga, and YesNome. That's where I started off at. I'm currently at PlaySimple. Worked on different genres of games, simulation city building games, tower defense, CCGs, RPGs, farm sim, word puzzle, and card. And if I look at what we are going to be discussing here, it's essentially nothing new. It is something that people have always followed for a long time. It is apparent and evident in any industry that you look at, because there is always somebody who is the first person to do something, but then you get other people who follow it because it is working and viable in the market, right? You get people who look at stuff that has already been done and always come up with the perspective that I can do something better by using a base that somebody else has made. And essentially, that is what drives innovation, because knowing that somebody else has done one aspect of a thing allows you to learn from them in some sense. You are thereby avoiding mistakes that they have made and then looking at making your own mistakes, because it is time for somebody else to learn from what you've done as well. So, which is where we look at what is currently being called, let's say, the 3 I's method, which is imitating, iterating, and innovating, right? And just think of any aspect of life. Like if you look at how a child grows up, people look at kids from the time they grow, they look at imitating their parents. They look at learning from what they've done, how they talk, how they walk, and so on, thereby allowing them to create a base for themselves. Now, this base allows them to then make changes. It allows them to explore and bring in avenues of things that they feel are better suited to what they're trying to do. Now, if I walk a certain way as a kid, maybe I realize that there is something wrong with my gait, and then I make changes to it. If I see somebody building a building in a certain manner, I maybe learn how to make that better because I now know what my basis of how to go about building it is. Quick question to people in the audience. So let's take the top 2 pictures, the bottom 2 and the one on the extreme right, and if you can figure out what is common between, let's say, the sets of pictures, that'll be great. Anybody? All right. So if you look at the first 2 pictures on the top left over here, they're essentially Heyday and Farmville 2. They're both farm sim games. Farmville 2 came out much sooner than Heyday did, but Heyday was first to mobile in that sense in terms of how they brought out the same experience. They looked at what was working. They looked at a different market. They kind of improved on what they wanted to make, right? And next, if you look at Stumble Guys and Fall Guys, it's a similar kind of approach, because the ones who came next saw something that was viable and working. They looked at a gap in the market that was available. There is always somebody new who hasn't yet played a type of game that is currently working, right? Because irrespective of how many people in the world have currently played Fortnite, I'm sure there is somebody who has access to the internet who's never heard of it, my parents included. And you are always trying to get to a new market. You're trying to get to a new audience. And how you get to that audience is part of the journey as well. We are often limited by the fact that, hey, why have I not done something new? Another way to look at it is there a way that I can get something that is present with my own twist to a new audience as well? And that is essentially the growth scope that you look at and the kind of markets that you're trying to target. So we're going to be playing a game, and essentially most of this talk is not going to be surrounding a specific game, but then let's assume something called a Pani Puri simulator, right? There is this place in Hyderabad which is called Maharaja Chaat. You guys should check it out if you get time. It's actually a very popular place for all street snacks in that sense. And over time, I am from Hyderabad. I've seen the guy grow the business aspect of it. He has managed to go from a stall to a bigger stall to a fancy location to now an actual set of places around the city which deliver his goods and services to people, right? There are people who go to a branch because they value what that person is giving. Now, that is essentially getting people to come to you because you are providing them something that they like. You have designed an aspect or a, I don't know, experience that people are craving for, and you are able to do it consistently, and that is what they're looking to get. So we'll start with the first I of the three I's, right? So imitation, the action of using someone or something as a model or reference. If I look at something that is already successful, I get to learn from what is currently working in the market. I get to see where they're making mistakes. I get to see where they're good at things. I get to also figure out how people are reacting to what is present. If this guy is making, I don't know, 10,000 rupees a day per session, I would know that he has X number of people walking into the place. He is able to deliver Y number of plates of pani puri, for example, on a daily basis, and that sort of aspect is what you need to be looking at, where how you truly study what you call competition. If you break this down, I'm not sure if it's clear to people here, but everything has multiple smaller segments and aspects to it. Like the element of going somewhere and just eating pani puri, for example, is that 5-minute experience that you get. But if you actually try to break it down into individual pieces, there are multiple different cogs which have to spin in order for you to get that tangy and tasty experience at the end of it, right? There are different elements of how the tamarind sauce, for example, is created. It is how spicy it is how well the mashed potatoes are created in order for them to be pushed into the puri that you have to eat. It is the consistency of the puri itself, every different segment. And you need to necessarily be looking at what you're trying to imitate in order to granularly break it down to an aspect where you are able to fundamentally understand why that thing works. The ability that you should be looking at generating from within is how well can I look at my competition in that sense, right? Pick any game that you're trying to build. You usually start off with what you are good at. Now, assume that I suck at cooking. I mean, I am very good at the eating part, but the cooking aspect I might suck at. If I do want to get into this business, I would want to analyze what my competition is doing. Now, if there is a game that you guys are looking at building or replicating, truly understanding every aspect of that, right from how the UI or the UX of the game is, what it is doing in the market, how the players are reacting to the game, what are the segments of the game that work, why is the UX flow in the game a certain manner, why is the button in a specific place. Anything that is gaugeable in a sense, that you can add a metric to, is something that can be made better. We've grown up with that experience right from childhood. We've seen report cards. I've had really sucky report cards as a kid. It's been metrics of mine from childhood that have had the longest of curves in order for them to get better, but then that is something that people are used to. Everything is measurable, and anything that is measurable is something that can be made better, right? Because you have a benchmark, you have a baseline. For games, there are access to different tools that you can look at, like data.ai, Sensor Tower, forums for the games that you're trying to imitate or replicate from the Google Play reviews. These are all avenues that you can look at to gather information about what you're trying to replicate. Now, how this helps you is if you look at what your strengths are. If you as a developer are looking to, say, replicate and make the next Fortnite, you're trying to make the next Battle Royale, allowing yourself to learn truly by breaking down what is currently working gives you the ability to then look at what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and what are the requirements in order for you to actually work to make that happen, right? It's great to think of you being the person who will make something really big next, but it's also important to realize the path that you have to take to make that happen. And that path is often a combination of self-discovery in terms of how do I get to that end goal that I want to, as well as what has the person before me actually gone through to reach that end goal, right? It's not a fair competition if you're competing with a studio which has 400 people in it to make a game that is successful worldwide, but then you are a studio of 3 people and you're trying to replicate the same kind of brilliance. Because many small pieces make the big thing happen, and we are often only looking at the big thing and assuming that that's the easiest way to jump through. If I look at how you break this down, so these are 2 just reviews from Maharaja chart. I'm really drilling down into this. This is not a paid talk in any sense, but if you look at what people have said, right, they go to talk about how they like a specific dish. They talk about how they like the consistency of things. They also really value that the experience at that place is always the same. So learning to understand your future customer is vital as well, because although the market is growing, everybody is kind of driven down towards the same aspect. There's a couple of stores that you can put your game onto. There's the Play Store, there's the App Store. If you're working on PC or console, there's different stores that you have access to. But it is no longer enough in today's day and age to just build a great looking game, because the entire journey is what makes the end rewarding. It is the aspect of building something, then essentially being able to showcase that to the target audience as well, which makes a difference. And knowing who that audience is and really trying to drive deep down into what they're looking for allows you to temper your thoughts about how you're trying to build stuff as well. Like I've had, at the start of my career, visions of building fantastical games because, hey, you know what, I find it fun. And something that I learned over time, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a mistake of mine, but it's essentially realizing that although I find it fun to make games, and I am really thankful for being in the industry that allows me to essentially play games and make a living out of it, at the end of the day, I am possibly not the end consumer of the kind of games that I make. Like, I may or may not have really liked making word games at the start of my journey at PlaySimple Games, but then it's given me a new avenue to look at, a new customer base to kind of target my understanding towards and truly learn, right? Like, it's not like I can put myself in the shoes of a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old grandmother or a grandfather somewhere across the world who's not 35-year-old, sorry, a 70-year-old grandparent who's kind of playing games with their kids, right? We've actually had reviews which talk about how playing a few of our word games have helped people with anxiety. It helps people calm down. It helps people remain alert. And when I play the games, I don't necessarily see that because I am looking at it from a very data perspective and I'm looking at it from a metric-oriented approach. I don't necessarily understand the emotion that the player is going through, but then I'm trying to give them a product that brings about joy to them in some sense. And thankfully, over the years of working across these games, I've actually run into people who've played games that I've made, and that feeling has been really great. Like a few years ago when I was looking for a visa to the US for a conference or a meeting, I happened to have a conversation with the lady who was interviewing me at the embassy, and this was the time when we had just released this game called Madagascar Join the Circus. She was somebody who played the game. She had stuff to crib about the game as well, and it wasn't necessarily things like, hey, you know what, this sucks in the game and such, but then it was her perspective of why she's playing the game. So it was mostly about her talking about things that she liked in the game. It was things that I didn't even consider as somebody who was working on the game, right? Because we had something to build. We had something to showcase, and essentially we went about building that. But her perspectives on how she interacted with the game were new, were interesting, and eye-opening to the aspect that I didn't have a connect with that person. I had no way to possibly talk to them unless they sent in a support request saying that something is wrong in the game, right? So using the avenues that you have available to you to actually kind of figure out what your customer base is like, what they're looking for. If you look at most of the games nowadays, common complaints that I see for games by our competition as well as our games is essentially things like ads. And the most basic review would be, hey, too many ads, you're trying to show me too many ads, this doesn't feel like a game anymore. The customer on their side or the players on their side don't understand that you at the end of the day are still looking at this as a business. You're not looking at this as something that is fun for you to do alone, but it has to generate revenue. And revenue comes from multiple streams. You could be a premium game that essentially just focuses on people paying for the game and then live their life by playing through it. Or you're looking for this longest journey with the game where you're trying to add more content onto it. And learning that most of the competition is struggling with how ads are being shown, and essentially that is something that is a pain point for players, allows you to kind of think of, okay, how do I make a difference in the way I show ads in my game? What is the duration between ads, for example, in competitions games, right? If an ad is coming after every 5 minutes, is that causing a certain drop? You have access to this information from the different tools that are available in terms of generally looking at how things are measured. And since you're looking at it from a singular perspective, it's important to understand all the other avenues and look for ways in which you can get more information. Because data that you get from your analytics or tracking or somewhere online is just a one-sided perspective. Allowing you to build a full, wholesome approach gives you better context and allows you to better focus on how to do things. Now this, if you look at it, is essentially, say, a recipe for how to make pani puri, right? It has different components. Think of the games that you're looking at as the same. They have multiple pieces, and the pieces can be as granular as you want them to be. Now, you could either look at saying, hey, this box is red, so let's make mine red as well. You could look at this box being a certain shape, and that being good for you too. Anything, again, that can be measured can be improved. Because of the fact that things are driven into players' perspectives in certain manners, certain color schemes might or might not work. You might like the fact that the way you design a better looking box is good for you to look at, but then the reality of the situation could be that the people who are playing the game essentially are used to a different color scheme or are used to something else, right? So at the end of the day, unless you are making the game for yourself and a group of people who are essentially fully like-minded like you, the top of the funnel is very wide. It is as wide as anybody that you can reach. It is as wide as anybody who has a phone, depending on the kind of game that you're making. Now, depending on that, you kind of try and focus on how you break things down to analyze them. Here, I've listed like a bunch of ingredients and portion sizes and stuff, which would give you a specific result. Now, doing everything over here in that measure, in that sequence, gives you an end result X. There could be an audience for X, which is essentially just a bunch of people who like that very specific taste. The moment you try to expand that, there could be a different reaction to it. Some people might not like how let's say, the sauce is tangier than what they're used to. I've had people, friends of mine as well, who are from different parts of the country who complain about how food that is essentially available throughout the country has different tastes based on different locations, right? And that's necessarily what you're trying to do with the game as well. You trying to make the game good from your perspective might only work for a certain set of people, but then clearly looking at what folks who are essentially going to be driving revenue towards you at the end of the day and understanding how they are perceiving what you're providing is truly going to make the difference. Because let's face it, you are not currently playing your game for as many sessions as the players who are going to be playing it or as regularly as they're playing it, because you're busy actually building the game and you're busy trying to extend the life cycle of it. Again, I keep reiterating measuring everything because breaking the competition into bite-sized chunks helps you visualize the problem. Don't try to design by yourself from the start, especially if you are somebody who is starting off new. If you are an enthusiastic developer who's trying to make games, then it's great to have that design inclination to say that, hey, I am going to be making these revolutionary changes for things, and I am going to be looking at this from a very different perspective because I feel like my nuance is going to make that better. It's a good perspective to have. It helps you in the long run. It allows you to build on what is present, but then don't be blinded by the fact that that is the best way to go about it because somebody else has done this before you. You are looking at what other people have done, and you're looking to understand the decisions that are taken by others. The moment you try to figure out and reach a place where you're able to inherently understand what frame of reference other people are designing from, you will then be able to use that as a jumping off point. If you look at how you would kind of break this down, right? Like I spoke about how there are different varied aspects to it. Now, depending on the kind of level that you look at any scale of restaurants, for example, or even games from that perspective, right? You have games which are small in size, they're bite-sized and chunky. You have games which are large and take a whole big team to make. And all of these come with aspects of different elements that can be measured, can be tuned and tweaked, and essentially allows you to reach a larger audience. Now, if you have a game that is currently viable in a specific market, and you're trying to expand your horizon, we've seen that with a bunch of games as well. In the past, where you had match 3 games, for example, being able to reach a target audience, as the cost of acquisition increased, they looked at advertising in a different manner. You had games like Royal Match and games like Candy Crush and Toon Blast and such start showcasing ads for things which weren't even inherently present in the game. Because, hey, this is something that attracts a customer into my game. It gets a player interested in something, but then most of the complaints were the ad is very different to what the game is. And we saw over time that these games then started incorporating these as mini games within the game because they realized that in order to scale and grow, I need to have offerings which bring more people into it and allows for me to cater to a wider audience. And that essentially is back to you measuring everything that you're doing and understanding how the people who are playing the game that you're trying to make and grow are able to interact with it. There could be a base that you started off with which worked great for a while, but everything has a limit in terms of the audience pool that you can reach. And the moment you try to widen your audience pool, the more the lines get blurred between what you started off with and how you're trying to do it, right? You still have a base element that you're working with, but now the experience is catered to a wider audience and everybody looks at it from a different perspective. So start looking at measuring different elements of the game and learning from what is currently present. Use the ability to look at how different people are making games and building it so that you are able to fine-tune and tweak what you are currently working on as well. You could be using them as a great starting off point and essentially working your way upwards from there, but depending on what your skill set is, like I said at the start, when you take stock of what you're able to do, all these are essentially elements of you being able to pick and pull from decisions that you've taken. Like if your team is somebody who's been experienced in building games and has decades of experience building games, then you might possibly look at starting off at a different point. But if you go back to the previous game, you realize that everybody still takes their time to look at how stuff is working in the market. Now, you could either make small incremental changes and test it out by publishing the game that you're working on, seeing what is working or not. Or if you have a bunch of experience amongst the people who are working it, you will take decisions without necessarily having to reach the market because you have inherently done this in the past. And that allows you to kind of take that jump or leap forward. There's a bunch of tools that you can use available in the market in terms of getting access to different analytics and as well as data about games that are currently present. We at PlaySimple have an internal analytics tool that we use, which we've been building from the start and kind of work with that and use a few of these as backup as well so that we get comparable data that we are looking for. Now, iteration would be assuming that you have essentially mastered in some sense the ability to make stuff that is already present. You are now looking at repeating that sequence to yield a similar result. Now, what do I mean by a similar result? It is, if I've done something once, that's great. I've learned from it. Am I able to do the same thing multiple times and give the same kind of result, right? That is where you build your skill set in terms of how do you go about replicating this. If I am able to build a feature in a game and I'm able to do it across multiple games, great. I have now learned how to effectively build or drive and deliver that, which would be the iteration of that aspect. This would come in at a stage where you have achieved liftoff in terms of having built a base, having understood what people are doing, being a person who's able to do that. Now, if you see a game that you find interesting, you have done your research, you have done your back-end understanding of what the requirements are for the game. You have successfully built a version of the game which is yours in some sense. How do you look at moving ahead from there? Now, that is where you try and deliver on the game consistently. The game has different sets of features that you look at building. The game has different aspects and elements to it that you essentially know how to drive forward because you have now understood how it is being done in other places. You have now figured out what are the different elements or aspects of actually building this game that I need to be working on as an individual, which allows me to figure out what my roadmap for the next 6 months, 8 months is going to be. Consistently working on smaller chunks of the game, depending on the kind of game that you're working on, and putting them out into the market allows you to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what aspects of things that you feel are consistent on your front are still viable and working, which is where measuring things becomes an important aspect, and using that as a benchmark to jump off into doing other stuff allows you to figure out how I can go about competing with what you would consider competition. Consistency becomes, like I said, the most important aspect because you are trying to deliver this at scale. You are trying to deliver this across different types of games. Depending on the kind of game that you are, the kind of studio that you are looking at giving the players a consistent experience. If I started playing your game and I have been playing it until D7, until D15 or D30, there is a need that I feel is being resolved from what you're providing to me. And you can't necessarily backtrack on that in terms of how I am experiencing the game. You can't have features which suddenly break the game, can't have features which are so tangential to the approach that you have been giving me for the last 15 days that I now look for other places to go. Because it is an important aspect to get people into the game, but then retaining them is going to be the harder decision. Depending on whether you're trying to make a premium game which has a fixed life cycle or a live ops long-term perspective of the game, consistency in that game becomes harder and harder as you try to make it available for a longer amount of time, because you are trying to fit more things into it while not bursting the bubble. You're trying to add things into the game which keep people engaged, keep people interested, and wanting to keep coming back to the game, but at the same time trying to deliver an experience to them that they like, that is consistent with what the market is doing, and also growing while more people come into the game. You can look at starting off any of the games that you have. I would take an example of one of our games where we started it off as the base anagram game. Over time, it then went into building additional features which we heard from our players that premium players needed because they wanted harder content. Then it went into adding clans, it went into adding clubs. All these were things that the market was doing and essentially was something that the players were requesting or asking for as well. Because the moment you are in a market which has as many people as are currently present, seeing as to how low the barrier of entry is depending on the kind of game that you're doing, consistency is key in order for you to be able to deliver that experience and hold on to people that you have worked so hard to bring into the game. So back to sugar, spice, and everything tangy. Play around with what is available. Once you have established a baseline, you've established that people are staying in the game, they're looking forward to you getting or you providing to them what they're looking for, you can now start making tweaks and changes to the game that you're working on because they now are hooked onto it, right? You've given them something that they like. Think of it as, I don't want to say drugs, but then, yeah, something that really hooks people onto what they've started off with. But it is what keeps them coming back. It is an experience that you get. Now, if you play Royal Match, for example, I've been playing it for a few months now and then. I've also read a lot of reviews where people say that, hey, once I play Royal Match now, I'm unable to go back to playing Candy Crush because of how they've made the experience better, how they've added aspects to it which are not visibly apparent up from the start, but then once you do play the game side by side, you kind of realize that the latter is slightly clunkier than the former and how they've made the experience better. The visuals are a lot more apparent. They give you a sense of joy that the other is not delivering. And this truly keeps people hooked onto it and allows them to keep working towards adding more things onto it because the players are liking what they're getting. So the final stage, right? Like now you've gotten the players into the game. You've essentially managed to deliver what is available on the market. There are hundreds of games similar to what you're trying to make. You've now gotten your own set of people who are hooked onto what you're providing. They like the juice that you're giving, and they look forward to more and more of it on a daily basis. This now allows you to expand your horizon of whom you're able to target, how you're able to target them, and look at more avenues that you can get people into the game for. So this would be the step of innovation because now players are looking for something more. They're looking for what are you able to provide, which would then keep them retained within what you're able to do. Why should I continue to play your game if there are tens of other games on the market which are essentially similar in a large sense of things? Why do I play your game? Because the other one is providing a more lenient economy, for example. I get more coins in somebody else's game, but then yours is also similar. What exactly are you doing different while keeping the base consistent with what my target audience likes? So you can then look at how you make changes, right? If you go back to the same Pani Puri stall example, you have now created a base. People like what you're providing. They like the consistency that you have. They like the taste that comes to them when they eat stuff at your place, right? You can now look at how do I make that better. This is all about adding new features into the game, adding changes and tweaks to the game that you have built, established, and created a segment for yourself in. Now here you can get to adding new features that people think, hey, this is the game that I like to play again because they have something interesting in it. You will get copied most likely by somebody else who's also looking at the same games, but then if you don't necessarily add to the community, you are not going to be able to expand within the community as well. Everybody is looking at each other. There is enough amount of data available outside in the market for people to look for things, and essentially growing from there is how you're going to be looking at it. Some of the examples here are if you want to add liquor into your Pani Puri, I guess, for an adult-only version, or if you want to play around with the dough, play around with the consistency, the kind of things that happen with it. Look at all these as elements of the game that you can play around with, and then focus on expanding and innovating from that aspect. And so to reiterate, first you identify something that is working in the market, then you imitate what is working in the market, you look at iterating what is working in the market, and then you finally innovate to make a better V2, hopefully. Thank you. That's my time.
Thank you so much, Vatsal. Prior to your talk, I really wasn't thinking too much about Pani Puri, but after this talk, I definitely think I need to get some Pani
Maharaja
Puri.
chart, in case you want to go to a place.
Great. So, guys, there's the QR code. Please scan it if you'd like to give your feedback on Vatsal's talk. It's really important for you to get your feedback. It's just like one question. Shouldn't take more than a minute. In the meantime, while you're also doing that, do we have any questions from the audience member? We have one question on that side over there, and I'll come over there in a bit. Yeah. Is that mic working? Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Good talk. And my question is, as game developers, we are in generally disconnected from the people who play our games. Like, we don't see them every day. We don't know what they like. And the games that we like to play are very different from the games the other people like to play. How do you acquire enough connect with them? Like, how do you know that this is something that they will like? Usually, what I have figured out is that as developer, I try to overcomplicate things, but sometimes the simple things are the ones people like. How do you get that connect? Like, how do you know, okay, this works, this doesn't work? Like, I made a game, I thought it was very easy, simply because I made the game, but when I gave it to my friend, he found it was too difficult. So, how do you gauge that?
So, that kind of goes back to understanding the audience that you're building the game for, right? So, depending on the kind of game that you're building and the scale that you have for the game as well, iterative releases into the market allowed you to kind of understand what the audience that you're targeting really is looking for. Essentially, doing your research before you even start making the game is probably the most important aspect of understanding what is currently working and why people are playing certain kinds of games. And if you're trying to make something that fits into the same market scope or audience, that would give you insights from different forums, different review websites and such, that allow you to understand why people are playing those games, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, and then use that as a comp to what your abilities or skills are in order to actually deliver something better. And it is most likely the situation that people here who are making the games are not necessarily the ones who are the audience for the game as well. And that kind of puts you into a place where you can think and look at what the market is like, and should you really be making that game if your skill set is a certain aspect and the requirements for the game are something else.
Hey, I'm Abhas. Thank you for the talk. Just, I think a quick question on the lift-off phase, right, where you're saying you achieved something where you're matching your competitors, but reaching that could take time, right? So at what point do you say, like that test of viability where you say that I should continue, and because maybe even reaching that stage of, hey, now we've matched our competitors could take some time and iteration in the first place.
Definitely.
So, I mean, maybe through your own experiences, have you encountered scenarios where like, hey, this game was way short of what our competitors are, but we see potential, and so we're going to keep working on it versus let it go?
I think, so that goes down to a factor of appetite. It is predominantly how much time, money, effort are you willing and able to spend on a certain game that you're bullish on. And depending on what you've kind of analyzed as the sphere of the market that you're trying to make the game for, and the longevity of how long can you actually take to deliver something or release something into the market, you can then work on figuring out whether it is making sense or not. And there's different methods that you can follow. The most common one is usually building that MVP of the game, which has a vertical slice of the core experience of it. You can start right from the initial aspect of it by, let's say, doing marketing posters for maybe an art style that you're trying to work on. See whether that is something that people like. That allows you to kind of narrow down on which direction for the game visually works. Then maybe do a test with the combat system if it's a combat game that you're doing. If it's a puzzle game that you're doing, then see if that core element of what you expect a player to be playing for 365 days or 720 days is even viable. Is that fun enough for me to do repeatedly, and are players reacting or behaving to it in the way that you want, right? It's great to think of all the ancillary elements and aspects of the game which you truly would believe make the core element of it, but taking a match 3 game, for example, if that one swipe didn't make sense, I wouldn't be playing that over 3,000 levels or more, irrespective of how visually appealing the game is or how fun it sounds or stuff like that. So consistently looking at that and knowing what your competition's ability is in some sense. Like you could be making a game that also, like I said, a 300-person studio is doing. So how much can you truly make to compete also would define on how long it would take. Like we've seen games where bigger studios have maybe replicated them in half the time or 1/3 the time because they just have more people to throw at the problem, right? And they see something that is working and are able to build on it and do it quicker. So that kind of balances out the perspective that you take when you look at launching something new into the market.
Hey Vatsal, Sankalp here. So you were talking about how you would use the innovation step for further user acquisition, right? But how do you tackle the challenge of initial user acquisition without the innovation step? Because you're not really able to understand what the what the user base likes in order to innovate further on it, right? So how do you tackle that initial user acquisition challenge?
So I guess over there, depending on what sort of a game you're making, like if you're making a premium game, then there are avenues that you can look at which would be different, which is mostly about player outreach or looking at forums or essentially looking at players who play different types of games that are similar to what you're making. If you're working on a free-to-play game and it is going to have ads in it, for example, then you have access to different ad networks that you can tie up with. You can start having conversations with them about testing the game that you're making, have smaller prototypes of it, look at how the audience is reacting to advertisements of your game, of the gameplay that the game has, and then kind of figuring out what is working, right? If you're essentially looking at something that is already there, you have a benchmark of what is working. If you know that the game that you consider competition is making $10 million a year, you know that it is doing certain things right, which is why people are playing. So you use that as a benchmark. And that allows you to build on top of or essentially jump off to make something better.